All right, today on UVA Legends podcast, I have Yvette Sadler Butler, a UVA classmate of mine. Well, she looks much younger, but I think she's actually a class or two before me at UVA. I think 86 at UVA. Is that right, Yvette?
87.
87 UVA. Okay, 1 year at UVA. Yvette is the CEO and founder of Hive Wealth. She's done amazing things in the financial world, and she's going to tell us all about that. Yvette, great to see you. Thanks for doing this.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Oh, of course. Well, the first thing that jumps out at me, let me go through your background first, because some of it's kind of unbelievable. After you graduated from UVA with a BS in finance, I believe, from our Comm school, you got your MBA at Stanford, which must have been an amazing experience. And then, I mean, when I look through the companies you work with, you spent, it seems like 4 or 5 years at some like the who's who of American financial institutions.
Yes.
McKinsey, Charles Schwab, Merrill Lynch, E-Trade, Wells Fargo, Capital One. Finally became president at SVB Private Banking out in Southern California. And what's interesting to me is after being a corporate animal your whole career, all of a sudden you're an entrepreneur and you started your own company. So I have a feeling this is a passion project. You started Hive Wealth, which you're CEO and president. So why don't we start off, first of all, talk about why you founded Hive Wealth and what inspired you.
Yes, it does sound a little crazy, but it makes sense when you hear the backstory. So I'll start with the backstory at the Comm school. So I was a finance and MIS, which was technology concentration. But my first passion and my first love was actually technology. And I had a cousin who worked at Riggs Bank. You probably remember that from DC.
Sure.
I think they got closed down for international money laundering, but I digress. I had the summer before 4th year, she got me a job in the technology group and I loved it. I was a COBOL programmer. Cool. I was, throwing back Diet Cokes in the, lab. People today, the kids today will be like, what's a computer lab? But that's what I used to do. And that summer, I loved my work. I was writing macros for the International Bank. But it was a little too early because the technology department back then was in the basement. Remember, they had to have those cold floors to keep the mainframes cool. And I was like, no, you don't put baby in the basement. So I came back and I was like, I'm going to Wall Street. So what ended up happening is I spent my whole career at the intersection of finance and wealth management. And so right after business school at Stanford, I went to Charles Schwab. And there was a mentor. I had worked for him at McKinsey. He started the strategy group at Schwab. His name's Art Shaw. He lured me into the intersection of consumer and wealth management and technology, which is really where I've stayed. And he left. He ended up being the CEO of a company called mycfo.com that has some similar characteristics to Hive Wealth. And I've been here ever since. And just kind of entrepreneur at heart, and weaving together different technology for wealth management. And usually I was hired in all those 8 banks, if you counted them, it is 8. I was hired normally to make the brand relevant for the next generation. And as you know, the next generation is very much dependent on technology enabled experiences. So it kind of makes sense. I was growing new businesses for all of these banks that were technology based. So I managed digital teams. We built our own robo advisor at Capital One. And I think I was just collecting jewels and gems along the way, both secrets about money and ways technology can make experiences much more accessible for the average saver. And so I was being an entrepreneur for most of my career. And then finally, between bank 7 and 8, I started Hive Wealth, which was just, what if a Black woman, me, took a white piece of paper and said, what if I were to start with money, what would I build? It's completely different, I think, than what's out there. So that's the story. Makes a little bit of sense.
Yeah. Well, one thing that's interesting, it's a software-based service, and it's AI enabled, or however you say that. So it's very current in the way it sounds. Yeah. So how are you guys different? I've never really heard of, I guess, finances through software is very logical, but yes. So how does it work?
Oh, great question. So yes, one of the things, if you take a step back, what we're trying to do with Hive Wealth is close the gender, generational, and racial wealth gap. And I firmly believe, just to focus on the racial wealth gap for a little while, you can't close that gap with emulating traditional models. We'll never catch, the race is over, right? We'll never catch up. So what we have to do is leapfrog to where the puck is going. Very famous Gretzky quote that the strategists use all the time. And the puck is going in this generation. I mean, a lot of these changes, when the internet came, we didn't quite know where it was going to end up. It's really clear where AI is going. We're going to have a personal assistant, a generative AI for everything. So for example, you're going to be able to say, hey, I want to go to the Caribbean. Give me some ideas. It'll come back. Here's 10 trips you could take. And you say, I'd like trip number 4, book it. And they'll get your flight, your hotel, your excursions, your reservations, everything. That's going to happen in your home. That's going to happen in your travel. It's going to happen in every part of your life. So Hive Wealth is a personal financial planner using generative AI for your money. And so that was the idea. And the core statistic is that people who have a financial plan have 3 times the net worth of people who don't. But financial planning is boring and overwhelming and easy to avoid. So we put you in communities of peers to make it engaging. So we have 3 communities: gig workers, professionals, and entrepreneurs.
Yeah. It's interesting that you said that about financial planning, because I think one of the things that holds people back with financial planning is they're almost embarrassed about where they are. And if you can find ways to allow them to do it on their own, I think the privacy would make them more willing to actually engage.
Yes, yes. It's a lot of shame around money. And that's meant to keep us from learning and engaging, right? There's shame around, you feel like you're behind, or you might ask a stupid question, or someone might be offended because some people are very private and they don't want to tell you what they're doing with their money. But that keeps us from growing. One thing I learned at the private bank, the very high net worth folks, I'll tell you an interesting story. We had them, in addition to the banking, we had a office in Napa Valley. That's actually financed ventures, but that's another story. We got about 10 high net worth professionals, VCs, in a room. By the end of the conversation, they were airdropping their portfolios. They were showing their specific portfolios to each other, because people that are in like circumstances want to learn from each other. And then even more funny, they started talking about even travel. They want to travel like others travel in their group. So one woman got her travel agent's license and books all their travel. So this is what the very affluent are talking about. They're sharing, they're talking to their kids, they're sharing best practices. And that's why the gap is widening. And so what we have created with Hive Wealth is a digital family office for next gen savers. So you can get the same experience that I just described from a high net worth customer standpoint in a place where, the mass affluent saver can interact with it.
And do you think your target is folks that may not have been able to take advantage of some of the investment tools that are out there? Do you think at some point you'll widen this and you'll be making decisions on a grand scale like you did in your career when you're maybe helping to make decisions for endowments and other things that you did in your career?
Well, not necessarily endowments in the traditional sense. So again, this is very much a community-based experience. So it's based on 3 pillars: community, content, and context. Community, I described. One theme from my career is the number 1 place people want to get investment advice, financial advice, is from friends and family. But I don't know about you, but my friends and family did not grow up dealing with money all day. And so we give you money peers where you can get the help that makes relevant sense to you and your group. Context, the traditional financial advisor experience, if you have a great advisor, is they sit you down each quarter and say, guess what? You beat your custom blended benchmark by 10 basis points. That means nothing to no one. Or you might see an article that says the average 401k is $120,000 this year. Again, nothing to no one. But in the context of your own Hive, if you're in the professional Hive at a certain age group, we've got early career, mid-career, late career, then that makes a lot of sense to see where you stand versus your peers. And then content. So we have bite-sized videos that are from finfluencers, as they're called, people who already have a community of people that are following them and have found a way to communicate money ideas that are resonant with people to get you to act ultimately.
Yeah.
And so it is a software service, but it's also a marketplace. So right now we have an ability to get a estate plan or a trust or a will done in all 50 states. Next, we'll be adding term insurance, long-term disability, kind of like an Amazon for wealth planning. So this is not something that's out there. It's about where we think the puck is going.
Yeah. What kind of investors have been the most excited about getting involved with you? I would think this would be a very exciting idea for a lot of people.
Yeah, well, I think our target is next gen savers, right? You have to be willing to talk about money. You have to be willing to share your data for the collective. You can't, your individual portfolio won't be floating around.
Sure.
And you have to have already figured out how to make more than you spend. It really is for wealth building. So
Right.
that's our target customer.
But I meant, instead of customer, I meant investors, who the folks that are invested in you, your investment groups that are behind you. I would
Yes.
think it would be very exciting for a lot of people to get involved in this kind of venture.
Oh, you would think. Let's talk about that for a minute. So last year we skirted a recession, as you know, but there was a huge recession in two particular asset classes: California real estate, which I'm still in, and venture capital. It has been the goalposts have moved dramatically. So what used to be a pre-seed is now a seed, and what used to be a seed is now a Series A, and so on and so on and so on. So it has been very, very difficult in this environment to raise money. So most of the seed venture capitalists that we've talked to are still very interested and excited, but they want to see certain revenue traction metrics. That used to be what you had when you had an A. So the investing in ideas in venture capital has kind of dried up. So in December, we closed our seed. We raised 3.4 million.
Wow.
So that was bootstrapped by me. And this summer to end of year, we're looking to do our Series A. So the two institutional investors are Silicon Valley Bank, before they had their trouble, and a Black VC, which sprung up, quite a few Black VCs sprung up after George Floyd, which is really exciting, called Black Tech Nation out of Pittsburgh, led by David Motley. So that, and then the rest was angel investors, friends and colleagues from UVA, from Stanford, from the 8 banks, like anybody who would take my call. And I think the word started to get out, so that even got harder.
Yeah. I've done startups in my career, and I've also worked for mid-sized corporations, big firm, but mid-sized corporations. Have you enjoyed, raising money, making the phone calls? When you're in a corporation, when people saw your name on their caller ID, it would get scared and things would happen. But when you're an entrepreneur and you're building a company, it's a little bit different. And I find it really exciting. And I feel like I had my greatest success in my career when I was in that situation. But what about you? Are you enjoying that aspect of it?
Not at all. My joy is solving customer problems. I always describe it like this. Early in my career, I started right after UVA. I went to Merrill Lynch on Wall Street, and then I went to Schwab after business school. And where I would describe Schwab experience, which was so foundational to my whole career, is we would sit in a room and try to solve customers' problems. As an example, I literally remember being at a conference table. There were maybe 5 or 6 of us, and there were a bunch of statements spread out on the table. And someone said, you know what, this stack of customers, they're not individuals. This is what's become RIAs. These are advisors serving other customers, and they're using our platform as a back office. And that insight drove Schwab Institutional, which is, I think, well over half of Schwab today. And so it was that customer back solution and problem solving. Love that. I mean, I love it. I love that. Another one was mutual fund marketplace. I describe investment banking as a bunch of smart people with computers in a conference room. They're like, I figured it out. I figured out a new product. I know how to make money. And then you open the door and go figure out who you're going to sell it to. So my brain works like the latter, not the former.
Right. So that aspect.
The latter. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So aspects have been a little bit of an adjustment.
Oh, yes. The next round, when we get to a more institutional round, that's what I'm used to, where you've got, all the data showing the trends, showing the execution. That part of fundraising is fine. But you got to get people to believe in you and to believe in a dream that has not yet materialized.
Yeah.
And I find it very stressful, but it's what you've got to go through as a founder to kind of get to the other side.
Yeah. Well, one thing about your career that's fascinating, and I kind of made light of it when introducing you, is that you've been in so many places for like 4, 5, 6 years.
Yes.
How important to your career has your willingness to try new challenges and go to new places, new logos been? I mean, I've done a couple of different things, but I like getting into a rhythm and a routine. And then when you go somewhere else, you disrupt that. You got to start from scratch, and you got to rebuild your reputation internally again, and all those other things. But how
Mhm.
about you? How important to your amazing success has your ability to start anew and go somewhere else and build it back?
Yeah, I think actually it was required to stay in the game. And I hope, I mean, you shouldn't have to go to 8 banks to get to the C-suite. You should be able to go to one or two or three max, right?
Mm.
But for Black women in particular, and I'm not sure, I can't speak, I'm not a Black man, but certainly for Black women, the experience is, I don't know if you've read like Melissa Harris Perry's book, but there's this notion of we're kind of the mammies of the corporation. So they'll give you divisions to turn around, to clean up, to get out of compliance trouble. And for me, I would come in and they'd ask me to, here's the small business that targets the next generation for our brand, but it's not doing anything yet. Can you do something with it? So I would go in there, guns a-blazing, with my strategic hat, dig through the rough, pull out the diamond, buff it up, and that'd be the perfect time to give it to a white man. And so you had to just kind of keep it moving to keep the career going. And somewhere between kind of the sixth and the eighth bank, I had pattern recognition. I see how this goes. I really want to be an entrepreneur at heart. And so I was kind of collecting gems along the way and really thinking about all the things about money that I would like to try to change. And then that became Hive Wealth. So I had Hive Wealth launched before I went to the eighth bank.
Right. Yeah. And do you learn? I know the different places have helped you, rise up the corporate ladder, but have you also learned about money because you work for companies with different philosophy, or all the
Yes.
financial institutions? They all basically see money the same.
No, no, learned a lot about money. I started out very self-directed. That was Schwab back in the day was helping investors who help themselves, right? And since I was in the strategy group, one of the first things I did and I always do this at a new job, this is a key when you switch jobs, is I go in and say, for the first 3 to 6 months, however long I can get away with it, I'm just going to listen. I'm going to learn, I'm going to watch, I'm going to observe, because people don't want to feel like you're just a gun for hire and you come in and you just whip out the solution immediately out of your bag of tricks. So I remember sitting in a branch in like Menlo Park, California, and I was there for the day, sat in the lobby. This is when the tickers used to be going from the back, and there was very high desk, like barely, the cartoons where your nose is barely over the desk. And I saw this with my own eyes. Someone walked in with $100,000 check, plopped it on the desk. They wrote up a deposit ticket and walked out. And the branch started high-fiving because they got him out in less than 2 minutes. And I was like, not one question about what are your goals with this money? Not one question. And then that's when we came up with a whole strategy to lower the desks, to train people that it was okay to ask a few questions, and then, got on the path of giving advice and not just self-directed trading. So yeah, it was just going and really listening is how I start. Start with the customer. And if you're always true to the customer, you can build great businesses.
Yeah, that reminds me of, I've been in sales most of my career, some kind of business development, and we never want to sell past the close. Once they put the money on there, they want to leave. That's fine. You're afraid if you ask a couple questions, they may change their mind. So I can understand that mentality. In your industry, financial industry, I don't know, much about how it works in terms of, rising up there. Is it the business development folks that rise to the top there? Or like, for example, I've been in the legal staffing industry for the last 25 years, a lawyer by trade. And generally the people that have become CEOs are the people that had the big books of business, and they end up becoming CEOs. What about in the financial world? Who are the people that become CEOs?
Now that's very dependent on what kind of firm it is. So in the traditional financial advisor-led businesses, where I didn't work in those kinds of businesses till the second half of my career, I was mainly in self-directed technology-based wealth management firms. But in the ones that are led by FAs, it's all about being a top producer, right? And I remember just sitting in the room one time and we were having a strategic discussion and we were snowballing into going in a certain direction. And someone stopped the whole progress of the conversation by saying, I called Joe Smith, $1 million producer from wherever, and he said he didn't like the idea. Conversation was over. And I had never seen anything like, I'm like, that's it? Like, there's no analysis, there's no projections, there's no nothing. So yes, that was the traditional model. In these more, and that's still true in a lot of parts of the market, actually. It's still true in a lot of parts of the market.
Yeah. So I listened to a great interview that you did. I'm losing the guy. He's an actor that interviewed you, but it was great. But you talked a little bit about your grandparents had some property in Texas that if it had been treated correctly, it would have been
Yes,
generational wealth. And I think
yes,
this is part of how you one of the reasons why you started Hive.
yes.
So we'll talk a little bit about your family and money. Like for example, my family, my dad was 20 years military, 20 years government. And then, my mom was 40 years Navy secretary, and they bought houses and they were able. So it was a traditional way to accumulate wealth and retire. There was nothing fancy. They were probably the first generation of African Americans to be able to do that.
Mhm.
But what about your family? How did your family manage their money?
Yes, I think it's so true of so many of us. I think it's just a classic African American story, right? My grandparents had a house in rural Texas, about 20 miles outside of Waco. My grandfather mainly ran the Shell. He built a little Shell mechanic station, so he sold gas and moon pies and big reds and fixed people's cars. And my grandmother was the first businesswoman I had ever seen and just adored her and looked up to her so much. We had a farm about 3 or 4 miles away, and she managed that. And all the kids would help. And then her both families were from farms in Texas. And part of the family had owned, as you mentioned, like 100 acres, not too far from where Valley Mills, where we grew up, or my dad grew up, and eminent domain, which happens so often, where they come and take the land and build the expressway through it. Well, in our particular case, it's flooded because they built a dam and it's all flooded. And so much of that land, as you know, has gotten developed, or they found oil on it, or all kinds of things. So with a moderate estimate of what it might be worth today, I think I estimated it to be about $5 million. And the point is, from a generational wealth standpoint, what could you have done with that, right? You could have built businesses, sent all the grandkids to college, on and on and on. So the story that I tell is that it's not our fault that the wealth gap exists, right? The average African American has somewhere in let's say 25,000 in net worth. Average white American has 3 times that. And financial planning, so people with a plan have 3 times the net worth of people without a plan. So that's one of the many ways we can close that gap. But most of that wealth came from land and housing. And what happened? Either eminent domain, they took it and, like I said, built a freeway over it, or we were redlined out of the appreciating neighborhoods. And then that money was passed on, and that house was passed on. So we know why the wealth gap exists. It's not because we take our money and only buy material things. That's a trope. So a lot of what inspired me to create Hive Wealth is really the beacon was that Maya Angelou insight that when you know more, you do, when you know better, you do better. And that's what Hive Wealth's there to do.
Yeah. Well, when you were growing up, did your parents talk about money? I remember our financial investor would come by, and my dad would be really excited to talk about these things, 'cause these are things his father couldn't do.
Yeah.
There was no finances to really manage. But I remember this guy's name was Norm Beckett. But what about you? Do you remember your parents having those financial discussions and sometimes not even doing it in front of you?
No, not really. I think we had more of the traditional conversations. Go to college, get a job, and stay there. So I clearly freaked my family out by moving jobs. I remember when I got the job at McKinsey, my dad was like, so what CEO is going to listen to you, a 25-year-old? Like, well, who's going to do that? I'm like, no, it's a team. It's not just me. But yeah, no, it was my dad actually, it's similar to Dr. Fauci. We moved from Texas to Maryland because Dr. Fauci has infectious diseases at NIH. My dad was reproductive
Oh,
science. So that's
I
why
thought
we
he was a
moved to Texas.
doctor.
A PhD.
Okay.
Yeah, but he did research like
Yeah,
Dr.
yeah,
Fauci.
yeah.
But they've moved the age of viability. I think it used to be like high 30s to like 20 weeks. At least you have a shot, right?
Yeah.
And so we were always very proud of the work that he did.
So you grew up in Columbia, I remember, right?
Rockville.
Oh, Rockville. You're okay. You're close. You were close then.
Yeah.
So what about your family? Did you have siblings and what are your memories growing up in Rockville?
Yeah, so I came when I was about 6, and my sister was 2, and my brother was 10. And so we were one of the few students, a long story, but I ended up going to Churchill instead of Richard Montgomery. And I had a great time, but I was, just always busy, always moving, and it didn't just happen at jobs later in my career. That's how I was as a kid as well. But we were, a little different just because, we didn't grow up there initially. And we were just in a very white community. But it's changed completely. Like Rockville and Richard Montgomery are very diverse now.
Yeah. So why'd you decide to go to UVA?
That's easy. My best friend from high school came to my high school in 10th grade or 11th grade? 11th grade, and I was in 10th. My high school started at 10th. And her name is Wendy Peel Greer, and she was class of 86. And so I only applied to 2 schools. I was like, oh, Wendy's going to UVA. I'll apply to UVA. And I applied to Rice because I'm from Houston. And I got into both. And then I was like, I'll just follow Wendy. It was really simple.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when you got to UVA, since you're from Rockville, and I'm a year behind you, I'm from Fairfax. I remember UVA feeling very Southern to me when I first got there, which was surprising to me because it was only 80 miles or so from my house.
Yeah.
What were your first impressions of the grounds?
Exactly. You know what? I'll tell you the story. Wendy and I drove to UPenn because I was going to transfer. I was like, everybody's from Virginia. I just thought it was very, very Southern, even though I'm from Texas, so I don't know. It just seemed, I don't know. I felt like everybody knew each other and it was hard to break in at first. So yeah, we drove up there and I applied, and then, you find your way. I think that's the important thing at any college, right? You got to find your people and you got to find your activities that inspire you. So eventually I got really excited about it.
Yeah. What was your impression? And we mentioned Southern, but what was your impression of the race relations there? I mean, you were at a circle, black sorority, the Deltas, and you guys, the black sororities, fraternities were such a huge part of campus life for us. I mean, all the parties were driven by sororities and fraternities. When you go to school, it's the fraternities that come by the dorm in your first year, introduce themselves, talk to you about the fraternities, but just be your friend, be your mentor. They're such a crucial part of the experience back then. And I think the way, as my son tells it, it's still like that. It's still like that today. But what about you? What is your recollection of the race relations at UVA?
Yeah, that's such an interesting story. So there was a program, and this will have a point, in Silver Spring, Maryland, that I did the summer of 11th grade, I think 11th going into 12th, that changed my life forever on a whole bunch of experiences. It shows you how important the government partnership is. So what the county of Montgomery County, I guess, had done is they created a program where they brought in high school and younger college kids. And we all worked for small businesses, small minority-owned businesses. So I worked for a woman-owned temp agency. But in addition to us really helping these companies, because we were getting paid by the government, not by the business, so that really helped them. But we were in a cohort, so we got classes on marketing, finance, all those things. I ended up doing business for the rest of my life. And I met a woman who you might not know since you're a little behind, named Lisa Hayes.
I know Lisa. Yeah,
Yes.
she's unfortunately
She passed. Well, we were
She passed.
pregnant at the same time. And so she passed, both having our first kid. So just a huge part of my life. But she was in the program too. So when I got to UVA, she was this amazing Delta, and not everybody knows this, but my mother's actually an AKA. My
Oh.
parents went to Texas Southern. My dad's an Alpha, my mom's an AKA. And I went to both rushes. I don't think you're allowed to do that anymore, but I did. And I called my mom and I was like, Mom, I've got bad news for you. I looked at both, but I feel like I fit with the Deltas. And she's like, nobody chose for me. I'm not going to choose for you, which was awesome. My poor mom, when we crossed, had to drive down from DC with like a car full of Deltas. So it's kind of an ongoing thing. So because of that connection that I already had before I even got to campus with my best friend and Lisa, I felt it was the first time in my life, because I left Texas, where I even had a core hope besides one person in my whole school, pretty much, that I could relate to. So in a way, it was exciting for me. It was better than home. It was more diverse than home. And I think we created our own little community. The thing I remember the most, though, it was towards the end of the year, and the director of African American Studies with Sylvia Terry. Am I saying her name right? Yeah, I remember. And so there's about 30 of us in the room in Newcomb somewhere. And she told us, and this stuck with me forever, you all have got to stop walking around here and the rest of your life feeling like you're forever grateful that you're here. You're here, you deserve to be here, hold your head up high and do what you know how to do. And I just thought that was such great advice. And I tried to take it everywhere. If you got in the door, if you got hired, if you got accepted, you deserve to be there and go and figure out how you can be your best.
She had that Maya Angelou quality to her, Dean Terry. She could just
Yes.
say something. But how important do you think to your success was being a Delta or in a sorority? I remember, I'm really good friends with Rennie, and we were still friends to this day. And I never pledged, but I always felt like the line process of all the fraternities, sororities. Um, they were driven, and they seemed like they had all the folks that pledged when that process was over. They had a fire lit under them somewhere, and it seemed to be a very positive thing. I mean, for a guy's point of view, I'm sure a lot of guys did it because they wanted the girls to like them a little bit more. That was a driver, but it seemed, the aftermath, it just seemed to really drive a lot of people to really good results.
Yes, a little known side fact. I was friends with Rennie's sister in New York.
Oh,
He
is that
lived
right?
with, yes, she lived with
Dawn.
Yes, with
Yeah.
Dawn.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really thought my impression was the Deltas were about the business, and that's what I was about. And another kind of idol, beacon, inspirer is Glenn Key, right?
Oh,
And
amazing.
her cohorts, remember Black Alumni Weekend, which is coming up, which I'm very excited about, started my senior year. 87, I think,
Oh, is
was
that
the
right?
first year. Yeah.
Wow.
And so we got to see them in action, that they knew how to pool their resources. And Glennie was president of the school her senior year. And
President of everything.
yes, I was an honor advisor and she was an honor advisor. So, just modeled myself after her. I was like, if I could be, anywhere near this fabulous, I'd be really happy.
No, it's amazing what that system does, and it's my son is, like I say, he's at UVA, and he asked me about pledging and without telling me he's going to do anything, and I said I can't give you any advice because I didn't do anything, but people who did so seem to be very happy with the results. Um, well, one thing that you did also is you went to comm school,
Mhm.
and comm school is very hard to get in, and like e-school, it really, limits what you can put on your calendar for the rest of the time you're in school. I mean, first of all, you have to have a lot of prerequisites to get in, then you get in, but you also have an MBA. What was the comm school experience like? And when you advise um, young folks who are going to college that they're going to get an MBA anyway, do you think it's a good idea to go to comm school if you're already going to get an MBA?
Wow, that is a very, there's a whole debate going on right now around, do you need college at all, right? So I am in the camp of definitely big on college. And if you have a passion for something, and like I said, once I did that program at Silver Spring, I wasn't interested in anything else. I took a lot of stuff on the side, like Japanese and political science, but I knew this is what I was going to do and what I was going to be. I wanted to be an entrepreneur. I wanted to change the world. I saw that was the best way for me to change the world. But business school, they're like, 5 or so years behind me, it got really popular just to go to startups, which is like going to business school, which is true. Because when you're in a smaller company, you get to do, you can be doing technology one day, marketing the next day, whatever needs to happen. And that's why I liked growing smaller businesses inside bigger banks. You learned how to become a general manager because you had to do every function over time because you were creating something new. There was no way to do it. And people also consider going and becoming investors, like at venture capital and PE is a way. So I think there's I think you have to want to go. And I think there's ways to survive without the MBA, absolutely. And if you go into college and you really want to study business, and start a business right after then, that gives you that optionality, right? Now, if you didn't go to the business school and you want to start a business, now you're thinking, well, now I have to go get an MBA. So I think it keeps your options open, yes.
Yeah. Now, has business school changed through the years? I mean, you mentioned before technology, which really surprised me. I didn't know that about you, but I can imagine what the technology would be a huge part of business school today, I would think. And that would be fascinating. I mean, are business schools very similar to the way they were? We went to school 20 years ago. I don't want to say 30, 35 years ago, but anyway, are the schools the same today as they were back then?
I think they've gotten more similar over time. So for example, when I was in McIntyre, I don't remember doing cases. That just wasn't part of the model. That was very much a part of Harvard Business School's model. And it's part of all master's programs. But I don't remember like undergrad Wharton or undergrad McIntyre being so case oriented. I think people are much more investing oriented. Here's a pool of money. Let's do some angel investing. Let's go work for. And I've actually gotten some pings for some interns, which I am going to try to do to come and work in startups. So I think that whole technology startup ecosystem is much more established now than it was back then.
I would think so. Well,
Yeah,
look,
it was in the basement back then. It was pretty bad.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know how they got you down there in the first place. Well, look, you end up going to graduate school in Stanford, and that sounds amazing to me. Are you glad you had that experience rather than go to school back east?
Oh, it was an amazing experience. Just this notion. I've always been a dreamer, but that was like taking a dreamer and putting them in a candy store, right? It was just so inspirational to see what you could imagine. So, for example, my favorite teacher was Jim Collins, Good to Great.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and he taught us a strategy class. So our team presented, and he was like, blah, 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 gave us our grade and our feedback. It's like, okay, everybody sit down and you come up one at a time. So I come up one at a time, and he said, Yvette, where are you going? I was like, I'm going to McKinsey. And he's like, oh, that's great. I went to McKinsey. It'll teach you how to break a problem into pieces and figure out a path forward for anybody, any company. And that's a great skill to have. And he said, but don't stay too long. And I was like, why? He was like, when you do something you're passionate about, no one can touch you. You're the best. But if you're not passionate about it, you're really mediocre.
Wow. How can he tell all that about you?
Just interacting for the semester. He's just a really insightful man. And then the other thing, as we were graduating, we were out on a bench, sunny day, having lunch, and everybody was talking about where they were going. Back then, it was a really big deal to go to the packaged food companies, like I think General Mills and P&G. And I'm thinking, I'm eating my lunch, and I'm like, I really don't care if it's 2-ply or 1-ply. So, and knowing what the Jim Collins had just told me, I got to go do something that I get excited about. And then we get to the end of the table, and it was like literally 4 different people, and they all said some version of this. Well, I have a benefactor. He's going to pay me while I look for a company. Then he's going to buy the company for me, and then I'm going to run it. And I was like, are you out of your mind? What? So just knowing this broader world, I feel like I've spent my whole career inside these rooms.
Mhm.
where I, again, have gotten to learn these little nuggets. And now in this kind of third stage of my career and life, I want to get those money secrets, those nuggets out to everyone. Because if you don't know with a piece of information to the right person what they'll be able to do with it.
Yeah. Well, look, speaking of money secrets, now I know a lot of your career was spent creating the vehicles and building the businesses, but in terms
Yeah.
of money,
Yeah.
it's going to be election year. It's going to be brutal watching the news, and we have high interest rates. It's an interesting economic times.
Very.
When people ask for free advice, which I'm asking for now,
Yes,
what do you generally tell people these days? I mean, this is a very challenging time, and
it is.
I listened to your interview. You like to have some money in tech stocks, and I got some of your nuggets. But what do you tell people when they ask you about what to do with their money?
Yeah, first of all, if you're feeling like this current environment is hyper uncertain, you are exactly right, right? Today, the jobs report came out, 353,000 new jobs. So this whole snowball of we avoided a recession last year. The jobs report's too hot for the Fed to start lowering rates, which was already priced into the market. And if we don't have the recession, then we can't get back to another bear market. All of this is just in a swirl, and put the election on top of that. Venture capital is still kind of frozen. The top of the funnel can't get out. People can't get IPOs. So when the top can't get out, it impacts the whole set of companies that are behind it at all the various stages. It's complex. What I tell people, that's why financial planning is so important. So first of all, don't overpay to underperform. So that means your core portfolio should primarily be in passive investments, because 80 to 90 sometimes percent of the active managers do not beat their benchmark.
Mhm.
So that means don't try to time the market and pick the winners, because even the professionals can't do that consistently. So most of your portfolio should be in passive. 10 to 15% should be in privates and alternatives. That's where real generational wealth is created with technology, new ideas, new businesses, new frontiers. And investing with angel groups and investment clubs, you can make collective decisions, so you're more likely to pick good ones. Or there's since George Floyd, there's been a whole host of new Black VCs, like the one that invested in us, Black Tech Nation out of Pittsburgh. So you can also become an LP in those. And then dollar cost averaging. Don't try to worry about Putin and everything else that's going on in the world. Pick a certain day, put a certain amount in every month of that, the 15th of every month as an example. What that means is sometimes you'll overpay and sometimes you'll underpay, but the average price you pay should be a good price because you're putting it in regularly. And then set it and forget it. And then the only last thing I say is have that 6 months of expenses in a accessible cash fund, high yield savings, maybe a few CDs, what have you, for a rainy day. Because what happens to us in particular is we come off the plan because something unexpected happens. And so then we start taking money out of the 401k, you lose a job, or you don't have enough money for tuition, which you're so passionately committed to, et cetera. And then that has dire consequences, both from coming out of the market, but also potential tax consequences.
What about real estate? How does real estate factor in to this? And I know that's a very broad question, but you didn't mention it, and most of us dabble in it at some point or another.
Now, I get in a lot of trouble with this one because my line sister, Sharon Ann Miller, is a real estate investor, and she says I don't pump it up enough. So there's two different parts to real estate. You got to have a house to live in. There's a lot of debate around whether that's a good investment. I think it's pretty straightforward. As long as you're going to live in it for at least 7 years and let it appreciate, housing, and it's one of the last tax credits, I have no problem with that. So we'll set that aside. The next part of real estate, that's where I've gotten burned the most. So I guess I'm a little sensitive, is if you can leave it to the professionals, invest in a REIT or in, something where there's some analysts that can give you good data on it. Now, people try to do things like flipping, especially in high interest rate environment. I would not do that. And then there's a lot of benefit to holding some commercial assets if you have that level of money. But I think it's better. There's some new platforms where accredited investors can get a piece of, mezzanine debt financing, et cetera. And I think that's better than holding the whole property. It's just less risk. So I think real estate is just like everything. Like when my cousins call me and say, should you do Bitcoin? I'm like, if you understand it? If you don't understand it, the answer is no. And otherwise, you need to find a good analytical pass-through entity to help you make good decisions.
Yeah. Now, are financial people like yourself, do you give yourself follow your own advice, or do you seek help yourself sometimes and talk to people, or do you like to do all your own investing?
I absolutely think people should seek help and advice. It doesn't have to be a person. It can be tools, or software. And I think plans that keep you disciplined. One of the things I think is so important is talking about money, both the successes and the mistakes. And the mistakes, I think, is emotional. I think it's easier to be emotional about a real estate investment. And so that's why I'm just cautious that, rely on the experts no matter what asset class you're in. Now, for example, if you have an expertise, like you are a doctor and you want to pick healthcare stocks because you understand where they are in the FDA process, and, I'm not arguing that. I'm just saying you need to be pretty deep in picking individual stocks. Otherwise, let the managers do it, or let the passive managers do it.
Right. But also this question of, but do you manage 100% of your own money, or do you go to experts too? I mean, when it comes to your own personal, do you seek help ever?
Yeah, that's the problem with us entrepreneurs, right? We think we all know better, right? So I'm very highly indexed in my own company, which is obvious. I don't recommend it. I did part of the good advice, and this is what I tell people: keep your day job as long as possible until, here's the part I didn't do, until your gig you can live within the means of your gig. So entrepreneurs are on the risk high continuum, definitely way over to the right. And so I wouldn't do as I say, not as I do. I'm also on some tech boards, et cetera. So I have quite a bit of private investment. I'm also on a public board, so that's a little more balanced. So if it's not your business, I would not be as risky as I am.
Okay. What about, do we do a good job teaching our kids about money? And what are things do you recommend that we can give to our kids about managing? Obviously, they want to save their money, save a percentage of it, but do we do a good job with that?
I don't think so. I think there's still a lot of shame and a lot of discomfort. Not all of us spend a ton of time on money. And I think even for folks like me who've been in banking for a long time, our kids, their eyes kind of glaze over, where you have to find a way to get the messages out that don't feel too judgmental. And what the very rich families do is they actually have a managed discussion and a business plan for the family. So I think that's something that we can start to incorporate. It doesn't have to be fancy. You don't have to go away on a retreat. You could do it at home. And even if your kids are going to just inherit your house, that's still a lot of money these days. And talk about, how do you want to handle it? What philanthropy do we want to do? Does everybody have a trading account? And, why don't each meeting, like if we have a quarterly meeting, why don't one of you come and present the stock you think the family should buy? I think there's a lot of ways to make it engaging. And I think the other thing is people don't want to talk about their mortality. I think that's part of the reason why we don't do it. And so then the money passes and everybody's scrambling, trying to figure out what you want and what we should do with it. And that's why I think estates and wills are so critical. And so, for example, I don't know if you were following Aretha Franklin, she had one will in the cupboard and one will in the couch. And so then the family had to pay lawyers a whole bunch of money to figure out what was the real will. It turns out that I think the one in the couch won, and the lawyers won. So you don't want any of that stuff to happen. Here's where all my documents are. Here's how you can understand at least what my intention is. And it's much better to talk about that now when you're of great mind and spirit, instead of just letting it happen.
Yeah. Well, Yvette, we're getting to our late 40s now, and we know people in their late 50s that are thinking about retirement. When you look around at our friends that are beginning to retire, are there lessons that you've learned? Like, for example, on Facebook, I used to get upset when I see people post their vacations. I'm like, well, I wish I could be in Holland or wherever they are. But now my Facebook friends are retiring. I'm like, retiring.
Yeah.
Uh, and a lot of times, folks I went to law school with who worked in smaller markets, they're retiring early than folks who worked in DC or New York.
Yeah.
And New York is not really a retirement town. People like to. It's just a different
Leave.
mentality. Yeah. But what about are there any lessons to be learned of our peers or older folks that are beginning to retire now?
The biggest lever that the very rich have, let me tell you, when COVID struck, I had so many clients in the private bank. Yvette, forward my mail to Idaho, Florida, Texas, all the places where there's no state income tax. So that is the biggest lever. You might choose for a whole host of reasons not to pull it. But once you retire, do you really want to stay in New York, or even California is really expensive? So that's the biggest lever. It's really interesting. What people used to do was sell their house in New York and move to Florida. And there was an interesting article, I think it was in the LA Times, where boomers aren't doing that right now. Interest rates are so high, and they're like, I could sell this, move to Florida, and have a much smaller place, and I'd be paying the same amount because the interest rates are so high. So I think the timing of when you might use that strategy is really important. The other thing too is that different states have different taxes on, retirement income. And most importantly, some states don't have an estate tax, if that's important to you as well. A good thing to know is the exemption is right now almost 13, it's like 12.9 million per person. So that's what, 26 million for a couple. So as long as you have your documentation set up, that much of an estate can pass tax-free to your beneficiaries. So I say the same thing over and over again. It's all about financial planning, right? If you have a plan, you'll achieve what you're intending, or more likely to, much more likely. And that's the most important thing for retirees. How do you want to live? It's funny, when I used to consult with people thinking about retirement, it was a really fun game. We would give each person a set of cards that had different, trips or a boat or, all things you could do in retirement. And they would do it separately, and they'd come together and didn't match at all. So you've got to also align your goals and figure out how you're going to make that work. Like, sometimes one person might say, well, once a year, I want to travel with my girlfriends. That's what makes me happy, as an example. So it's all about the conversation.
Yeah. Well, Yvette, look, this has been great. It's been so nice to see you. I don't think I've seen you since you graduated, because it was a year
Yes.
before me. This has been great. I can't wait to see you. We'll definitely have to have a coffee or beer that week. But last question for you. You had such an amazing career with all the jobs at these amazing financial institutions, your own company, all the boards that you're on as well. If you had to give a young Yvette Sadler advice,
Mm.
after all what you've been through now and the success that you've had, what advice would you give to yourself starting out as a 23-year-old entrepreneur?
I would say, I think for so long, especially for working women, that the conversation was about work-life balance, which is impossible. And I think that confuses you and causes a lot of stress, where you're trying to
Interesting.
balance all of that, right? And it's never in balance. And people should tell you that right out of the gate. And that I give this advice all the time about each day. Wake up and assume you have two rubber balls that can bounce back in one glass ball. One time the glass ball might be a kid's play. The next time the glass ball might be a presentation to the board. And just juggle them for that day, because the rubber balls are going to bounce back. And that helped me kind of middle career once I heard it. So it's not so overwhelming. And then ultimately, no matter when you can get to it, the goal is actually integration, where what you care about is what you do all day. And so figure out how you get to that as soon as you can, because it really is a joy.
And is that where you are now?
Yeah, that's where I
Oh,
am now.
yeah. I'm the same way. When I'm with a smaller, I love sales, And so right now, all I have to do is worry about is sales. And if I get a big project in, I got people who do all the work and they do a great job. So it's fun. But I
Yeah.
also love creating, doing a logo, coming up with the name Hive,
Yeah.
doing things like that are also fun. Hiring the people that you're going to take this journey with,
Yes.
that stuff is exhilarating to me. I've done a few of those and I really loved it. But I really admire you for doing this, and I think you've got an amazing concept. And I remember when I was reading about it and I listened to your interview, it's just so current, and I have no doubt you're going to be incredibly successful. I'll make sure I leave your contact information for folks who want to get interested in investing and as an investment, not just as a consumer, but that as well. Um, but
That would be great.
yeah. But anyway,
Yeah.
look, Yvette, this has been great. Thanks. I'm glad we got a chance to do this. We misfired a few times, but this has been amazing. I'm so glad we did this.
This was a lot of fun. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome. Let's do a better job keeping in touch.
Let's see you in Charlottesville.
Yeah, sure will. Thanks, Yvette. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.